Howdy from Yates American B244. In this episode we're finally getting around to adjusting all the feed system components, including the in-feed and out-feed roll, the chip breaker, and the pressure bar. Okay, so I've got the cutter head, I have the table adjusted to where the cutter head is just touching this gauge block. And the instructions say to adjust the in-feed roll, the chip breaker, and the out-feed roll, you need to lower the table by a 32nd of an inch, which is a half a crank. I'm going to remove this weight for now. And adjust this set screw down out of the way for now too. Okay, the manual leads you to believe for adjusting the chip breaker, all you need to do is adjust the height of this bolt right here that this rod rests on. But it's actually a little more complicated than that. There are two pairs of bolts at each end of the chip breaker. Here and here, you can adjust the height of each end independently. Those bolts, when loosened a little bit, allow the chip breaker to rack a little bit. And what allows you to adjust each end independently is this lug right here. So the height of that lug is adjusted with this very large set screw. This is probably about a 4-inch long screw down in through here that rests on a lug down on the inside. So each end of the chip breaker rests on that little shelf there. And then the lug that great big set screw that I was pointing out to you works on is that lug right there. So I'm going to start by loosening these screws just a little bit. And I'm going to set the chip breaker down on those little supports down in there. It's not resting on this center lug. I need to loosen these jam nuts here and here. So tightening the big set screw should have the effect of raising the chip breaker, and then loosening it should have the effect of lowering it. So we want that to just touch the gauge block. There. Then you need to try to snug up these bolts before you lift up the chip breaker and tighten them for good. And then you want to be sure and set this big jam nut. The in-feed and out-feed roll heights are adjusted using these jam nuts right here. You have to remember that the center plate of the planer is 50 thousandths above the in-feed and out-feed table. So for the gauge block you need to have a 50 thousandths shim underneath the outside edge of it. The drivetrain side is easy to adjust the height of the rollers. You do the same thing on all four corners, remembering your 50 thousandths shim for the table. The motor end jam nuts are a little harder to get to, but same concept. You know, adjust the height of the roller until it touches the gauge block. Well, despite my earlier claim about adjusting those rollers and the chain tension, I actually ended up adjusting them down quite a bit because the knives on the cutter head increase the diameter of the cutting circle, and so the rollers need to be adjusted downward to accommodate that. So I ended up with all kinds of slack in the chain. So I want to try to get all that slack over here near the tensioning cog. I basically want to end up with about an inch of movement in this long slack area of the chain. So that looks pretty good. The last thing I want to adjust is the pressure bar, which is this solid thing to the left of the cutter head. Now the instruction manual for the B244 says to run a couple of boards through the planer and stop the machine after the boards get past the cutter head, and then adjust the pressure bar down to touch the boards. I think that's a little bit simplistic and presumptuous that all the other adjustments of the machine will be correct at that point. In contrast, both the manual for the J180 and for my Delta wedge bed both say to adjust the pressure bar to be level with the cutting circle of the cutter head. So I've adjusted the table height so that that gauge block is just touching the cutter head, and I'm going to adjust the pressure bar to be level with that same spot. For adjustments, the pressure bar has a hold down spring on each end like this that I'm going to remove, and then it has this jack screw that adjusts the height of it. And like the chip breaker, the pressure bar has some bolts at each end that you can loosen a little bit, and that allows the pressure bar to rack a little bit so you can level each end independently. It won't move a whole lot, but it's enough to adjust for slight variations. And finally, on each end of the machine there's this set screw and lock nut that bears on the ring of the cutter head sleeve. I admit that I don't know what that is used for. So for now I just got them up out of the way, and when everything's adjusted I'll just set it back down and snug it a little bit. Right now there's quite a bit of a gap between the gauge block and the pressure bar. Just loosen these jam nuts and get them down, spin them down out of the way. I'm just going to lift the pressure bar and spin these up by hand a little bit. So now the pressure bar is actually resting on the gauge block. So we'll just gradually raise this end of the pressure bar until I can just move the gauge block down below. There we go. So down here at the other end, I cannot get the gauge block under the pressure bar, so I'm going to go up here and raise this end just a little bit. Hopefully that'll be enough to get the gauge block under there. There we go. So we'll lock this jam nut now. So it's always a good idea to go back and check things after you set the jam nuts, because setting the jam nuts can change the clearance a little bit. Before you put the springs on, you want to lift up the pressure bar and snug up these bolts. Like I said, I don't know what these jam nuts are for. I have not been able to find any information on them. You want these to be tight, but you don't want to distort the spring. I guess the last thing is going to be this brass plate on this outfeed roll. I'm not sure what it does, but I can tell you when I took it off there was a big mouse nest underneath it. So I'm just going to use a shim to give it some space between it and the outfeed roll.